either the emergent conversation or the lack thereof?
Sure, it's great to be here in Clubhouse in person with you, looking at you. Yeah, you know, I would say this conversation reminds me a lot of the debate that I see happening in the world economic development, and an area I'm a lot familiar with. This is my first COP, and I don't have a blue zone badge, so I'm sort of COP fringe here. And but I have been to over 100 World Economic Forums and seen how people will kind of blame those that are sitting in positions of power in what I, lovingly might call cockpit in society, because it's embarrassingly male-dominated. So, in this case here, it's clear coming together, coming to a general awakening. Look, what we've been doing hasn't been sufficient. We're still operating in silos, even the big silos across the private sector, the social sector, public sector. But the piece that I've come to a general conclusion is that I think what we're looking at is a bit of a failure of leadership because of the design of the system. The people that rise to the top of the existing system are kind of complicit within the reward mechanism of that system. And when we realize that the reward mechanisms of that system are fundamentally at odds with nature, they're fundamentally at odds with the natural planetary boundaries we have, recognize it actually isn't their fault. They're like winning a rigged game. And, when you come to the point in life where you realize that the world as it is today is a house of cards, I think it's a fool's errand to look at the people at the top of the present pack to pull the bottom out because they have the longest fall. They actually don't have the incentives, they've got the anti-incentives. They are very fear-driven because they think that a new system is going to come with war and chaos, etc. And so they're not actually necessarily the place to look for the systemic, wholesale, new systems design solutions that we actually need rise to the challenge today. But that is happening here, and it's happening in it's like you get this social milieu in the next year. And I would say more and more people are coming to the same conclusion that it's not tweaking the existing system we have. It's not like recognizing that, we need to wait for nations to rise to the occasion. Because nations have known this, this is like the 26th COP, right? It's like we've been talking about climate change and we argue for over 100 years now. We've at least been aware of it since the early 20th century. But at scale, we've been aware of it certainly, explicitly since the 70s, and nations have continued to fail. So I think we're at a point where putting our confidence in nations rising to the challenge of climate change, I think is not a reliable. I don't think they deserve that trust. And so for me, this is about looking at solutions to go hyper-local and planetary at the same time. So I think you need to design systems that are planetary scale within planetary boundaries, but implemented locally. And a big part of that is reimagining financial systems.
A song about a week ago with Lucian. It's a beautiful line. It's like, some of us be dancing and some of us be danced. Some of us are asking and some of us don't want anything to be asked. It's very curious because I think it's a question of sovereignty as well, where there are complex systems where we play a pawn's role. And it's even curious because there's people who are very high up the food chain. Even if you take the financiers, for example, if we take the people who work the economic system, they are more philosophically and cognitively enslaved than most anybody else. They're forced to think of profit and economic performance above all else, as if it was religious dogma. Which puts us at odds, you know, the people who are dancing and the people who are danced. We've also got a very good friend, Benjamin Van Wong, and it's actually curious because I know him so well from the sound of his voice. I have not met him yet personally, but I know that he's a beautiful human being. And from what I understand and gather correctly, Ben, your type of activism is using art to change narratives and to change the relationship people have with the world around them. Is that correct? Is that a fair assessment?
I suppose it's something that I try to do. I think that art has the power to shift perspectives, or at least good art does. And that's what I try to do with the work that I create.
All right. Well, we see that you've been, you create beautiful photographic works of art and art installations. And right now you're mostly working with plastic. That's right. Is there a point where you feel that you're banging your head against a brick wall because you're making a point and people kind of understand and they see what's happening, but somehow feel that you're not getting through all the way? Tell us a little bit about that, because your journey's been a long and arduous one, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that all activists may feel, that because, I mean, the definition of being an activist is to be fighting against an existing system. And so for most of the life of an activist, you're losing the battle, right? You may have like wins along the way, but you're fighting against an entrenched power structure. So at some point you just feel like, well, I've done all the things, I've said all the right things, I've created the movements, but why is change still not happening? And I think there's definitely frustration there. I wonder if perhaps one perspective that I found helpful is to not think of change as binary, not to think of it as winning or losing, but rather a constant sense of progress. How are we moving forward in the right direction? And so when you opened up the discussion talking about good cop, bad cop, it has me thinking that, you know, regardless, there's always going to be good actors and bad actors, but maybe something to be hopeful for is to realize that the center has shifted and continues to shift and is even accelerating in a hopeful direction. And for sure, it's never where we want it to be. But this is true for all parties involved, that at least we can be hopeful that change is happening in the right direction.
You know, this is a great point you just brought up, my dear friend, because you kind of reach an existential question, whether this is just a power dynamics conundrum that has gone on for ages and ages, you know, and rather than fighting with weapons, we're fighting with ideas and visions and perspectives. But let me ask if anybody in the room thinks that we're actually at a critical point where something has to change on a much deeper level. And if it's just, you know, isms, a war of isms, or I don't know, social, political, economic ideologies once against the other, or we're actually at a very crucial time for civilization. Does anybody want to contribute to that? First one who jumps in takes the floor. Oh no, I'm on this mic. I'm gonna move further away then. Yeah, just keep things.
I'll take that from here. Yeah, so one of Buckminster Fuller's most famous quotes that I never tire of still is, you can't change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And there's a lot of nuance within that. And also, I think it's kind of incorrect in some ways, because there is a role for resistance and fighting and illuminating just how many perverse incentives there are that are keeping this current status quo, comfort, you know, convenient culture going. That's species suicide. And I think there is the need for some really big disruptions. And also, I find, confidence and solace in Buckminster Fuller's obsession with the word procession, and this idea that there's these, side effects or second order effects that actually become the main effect. So, as we get together to protest what's happening with, fossil fuel companies having more representatives than any other country at the COP, we're also coming together and sharing ideas on a just transition and how we can use this $74 trillion business opportunity of solving climate change to get that money in the hands of the people who have been genocided and burdened by the extractive economy. So I think it's underway, and I also invite everyone to really step up their courage and their bravery and stand up, speak out, and really share that deep unease that I think most of us feel when you can't actually even really hold, I find, just how fragile things are right now and how vulnerable so many ecosystems and so many species and us, even humanity, is right now. But it's so important that we voice that and make art around it and come together around it, so that we can make that transition that's required. Thank you.
I want to jump in. Thank you, Amanda. I want to share something from a talk yesterday I witnessed of a beautiful Ecuadorian woman who's the founder of Escuela de los Corazones, which is School of the Heart. She said, "Hoy, no mañana," today, not tomorrow. This moment is upon us now. It's not about changing tomorrow. It's the need, as Amanda so beautifully clarified for us, is today.
So lovely. I met an indigenous woman from, actually they were from Ecuador, Bolivia, and Argentina. And they were very adamant that the representation we need is female. And these were her exact words. She says, we bleed and connect with the world every month, with the earth every month. We are the ones that give life. We are the ones which actually understand what it is to bear life. And we need more of this heart coherence. Well, she didn't say heart coherence. She said more heart, more understanding the burden and the beauty of life. And it's really lovely to hear Amanda in a vulnerable place and opening up and really expressing how her mind understands what's happening, but the heart is crying. And so I'd like to ask the room how we console this, because I know as an activist, I also sometimes feel broken emotionally, and I don't know if I find solace in the mind or if it's the mind that kind of tricks you to keep going on. Kind of like, I want to put that out there, see if anybody, how they relate these two elements, the heart which hurts and the mind that tries to make sense of things.
I'd love to just jump in there because I deeply feel this and empathise with what was said. And I feel that Jamie Beale has got some good advice to share on this. He talks about digesting grief so that we may actually like step forward as what he describes as homegrown humans. He describes this point as a step change in how we respond to the collective trauma that we've had on, the climate, on species loss, on just deep social injustice. I think about it almost like as a pitchfork of institutionalized racism, institutionalized sexism, and institutionalized like abuse of our nature. And there's Jamie describes its need for bash healing, bash forgiveness. to integrate the trauma that's created from that. But one of the things that I think is really helpful here is this story of this experiment, this really cruel experiment that was done on mice, where in this lab, mice were dropped into a bucket of water, and I think I'm going to go off memory here, so don't quote me on these numbers, but consistently the mice would live an average of something like 6 minutes, just treading water until they gave up and drowned. But the experimenter took the mice out just before they died, let them rest for a moment, and then put them back in. And then the mice would then tread water for 48 hours, like almost 2 days. So it would go up by such a multiple. And I think this is a good example of like, we need radical hope for us to be successful. You know, I would give the example that, you know, we would have never landed on the moon. We would never achieve the moonshot if we didn't believe that was actually possible. And so, you know, I've heard a stat here, and I think you can correct me if anybody knows the exact number, but it's something like 87%, something in the like high 80% of people that work in and around the SDGs don't believe that they're actually possible. Frankly, because the SDGs are like the exhaust pipe of the existing system, and without fundamental structural change of the existing system, they aren't achievable. So I think what we're looking at now is like this question of like, how do we create a new mythos, a new story that seeds radical hope, that activates people to discover what is their individual planetary dharma, their individual unique role to contribute their like fullest potential to this growing team of people that are dedicating their lives to the transformation of the story into a story where all life wins, into a world that I think Bucky so beautifully described as a world that works with 100%. And for us, I'll speak about this later, but for us, that's the very intention of the United Planet game, the Up game. It's about seeing radical hope and starting from the position and the mindset that we've already been successful, and then how do we reverse engineer to that place?
I want to just take a moment also to acknowledge that Indigenous communities and are the first to experience the effects of climate change, and also like socioeconomically disadvantaged communities and countries are the first to experience the deadly effects of climate change, and the least to contribute to the causes of climate change. And I kind of wonder, like, within like Lucian, this really powerful example of hope that we like, what is it going to take also for people to acknowledge that, like, I just wonder, like, the people in power, like, I don't think they've realized yet what's on the line. I don't think they're like really understand the gravity of the situation, because I truly believe that if they did, they would do something. But yeah, I think one of the things I've been hearing expressed consistently is that the Indigenous voices need to be at the front of this conversation. They are protecting our earth, our waters, our land. So I just wanted to acknowledge that here.
Well, that's what we're hearing, right? We're hearing that more Indigenous voices need to be represented. Tia, what do you feel? Do you think that they're sufficiently represented in this context of COP, or are they more like mascots? Or are they more like just entertainment? Or are they used more just for, just for like beautiful decorative purposes?
Thanks for asking that question. We've actually been really, really lucky with representation this COP. And I think part of that is because of an invitation that we've extended to include them not only in, the peripheral activities, but actually the core activities that are happening, the negotiations that are happening. They're showcasing all of the impacts that they have on a local level, which I think has been received incredibly well. Within all of the pavilions, we've had a number of healing sessions. We've had parades throughout the Congress, indoors as well as outdoors. I think we have representation like never before, just to reinforce that again. And I'd also like to add that much of the work that they've been doing, especially the Arhuaco tribe that I'm quite close to in the Sierra Nevada in Colombia, have really extended the work that they've been doing to bring attention to their lives. Many of them do that without anything in return. It's almost as if it's, as they say, the little brother is misbehaving and they want to share exactly how the forest responds to that. Yeah.
That's an interesting point. And indeed, the indigenous people do feel that they have to educate us. But how do you feel that, for example, after these experiences here, after their prayers and their dances, that some of that permeates to the backroom decisions being taken? Because we all know that an ayahuasca journey or a transcendental hike in the mountains can change a human being. But do you think that nature is actually being represented in this space right now?
Sorry about the loud noise. I would say that we are nature. The distinguishing factor behind someone who is indigenous and someone who is in an urban environment is this link that we have through our DNA across a variety of communities, across a variety of nations, and people who come from the global commons. So yeah, I find that difficult to digest as a question, because for me, when someone says that I'm not nature, it kind of feels a bit weird.
That's a very fair point. That's a very fair point. Anybody else want to jump in on that?
One question or thought that comes to mind is, so nature being represented through people, I'm wondering if corporations can be treated as people. They can be sued. They can, they're recognized as having the same rights as a person, almost. How are we doing on the front of giving nature itself some legal rights and representations? I remember visiting Bhutan, I think maybe 4 years ago, and they had just implemented a law where anyone could sue someone in a court of law on behalf of nature. And so an example of how that might happen is if construction company building a road just started pushing a bunch of material down a hill and destroyed a bunch of trees in the process, then they would be liable for the damage that they had done. And in order for nature to be represented, a person had to stand up and invoke that. And I thought that was such an interesting thing. Is that something that any of you have heard growing as a movement in the last little while?
I just met a group of people who sued Shell Corporation. There's a group from the Netherlands of primarily activists that hired lawyers, and they won. They won against Shell, and Shell has to reduce their emissions, I believe in the Netherlands specifically, by 40%. And they've actually released a handbook. They've open sourced their process for how they were successful in suing Shell. I have the booklet. Unfortunately, I don't have the name on immediate recall at the moment of the group that succeeded, but I'm sure a quick Google search will be fruitful. Pretty impressive and exciting, and definitely inspiring for how we can do this more extensively.
Just a quick question, but is justice the answer? Just putting it out there. If we need to really act really quickly, do we need trials and courts and tribunals of public opinion for people to convince themselves that they're right or wrong? When at the end of the day, the only thing it will do is polarize, won't expand understanding. So is justice what we need at the moment? Or does anybody see another avenue which should be taken with a little bit more urgency?
It's really fascinating. I find this a really challenging question again. On the one side, I feel that there is this trauma that has been experienced, and acknowledging that and seeing that and honoring the harm that was done to kind of hurt these communities, hurt the planet, needs attention and it needs to be seen. Because without calling that out, it's actually quite difficult to confirm that it even happened. It's like ignoring it completely, like the Holocaust, complete ignorance about what actually happened for an entire generation of human community.
Yeah.
I totally agree. I think acknowledging and holding people responsible for these corporations that have such extensive impact and have no responsibility, I think it is very crucial that they be held responsible personally.
I think something I've been aware of in this, the social justice applied to nature aspect is David de Rothschild, who's a very interesting guy. He has created this legal framework for the voice of nature. Check it out, it's voiceofnature.org. And what he's trying to do is get representation of nature onto corporate boards and into corporate governance. That kind of expands the stakeholder awareness of the impacts of these corporations, to include more like people and planet. And I think there's some really interesting kind of developments in legal frameworks. But fundamentally, I actually think there's a bit of a history lesson back here that the problem actually dates back to, I think it was like the East India Company coming into America. It was my history is a bit sketchy here, but basically the US created the separation of the not-for-profit and the for-profit. And I think in doing so, we actually created a kind of schizophrenic system. It would only work if the not-for-profit or kind of quote-unquote social sector would be as large as the for-profit sector. But in reality, it's a dwarf compared to a giant. And so it's kind of like handicapped from the very beginning. And we then have these like economic policies where we talk about like externalities, or like economic externalities of a company's actions. And they shouldn't ever be considered externalities. Like the impacts on the environment need to be completely integrated into the supply chain and decision making of a company. But we're still living in a world where we haven't actually designed the corporate governance to exist as a kind of good corporate citizen within planetary boundaries and within even local community boundaries of extractive behaviors. And so I think this is an area where I would like to see us kind of reverse engineer from actually what's going to work, because I think if we continue to flog this kind of dead horse of a system that has got the siloed between the for-profit private sector, the not-for-profit foundations and NGOs, and then the public sector being kind of completely siloed approaches, I think we're actually not going to get to the system we need. And whether we need total system collapse to get to that transition point, because there's so many like agendas there, very hard to evolve this. reality is most of our global institutions were given birth to by the Second World War, and they're no longer fit for purpose. And so how we transition this, I think, is something where obviously our technologies and our governance capacity goes far beyond our present designs of things like the World Bank and World Health Organization and various other IMF, type organizations. The global institutions are no longer fit for purpose with this requirement, and they've consistently shown a very poor track record of rising to the challenge.
Let me make a little synthesis. Let us try to commit what we've spoken to song. And it's quite curious that yesterday Brian Eno was here, and he had a singer on stage. I don't remember who it was, but they were basically communicating that you can communicate, or you can transfer a lot more information through something that's laden emotionally, something like a note, or a note that's well sung, or a poem that's well recited. And I'm kind of circling back to something that I wanted to touch upon at the beginning of the conversation, which has to do with our emotional need for change and our mental safeties. I really like what you were saying, Lucian, at the very end, that all these complex systems, the IMF, monetary policy, all the things we have to consider. Imagine all the mental acrobatics we have to go with something that is in tune with our heart. And so, again, I'm wondering, do we need a special kind of cognitive machete to cut through all that intellectual red tape? Is it, Benjamin, is it art that's going to help us, bypass all those obstructions, mental obstructions we have? Is there something else? Because I feel we need to connect with the heart much, much quicker. And again, that's not my message. That's the indigenous people saying, if you don't feel the world's pain right now, then you're basically a psychopath.
Well, I mean, when I hear you asking the question, it sounds like you're asking for a silver bullet solution. And I'm not sure there is one. I think that there is a common enemy. The common enemy is apathy. And as long as we find a way to get involved, to stay curious, to learn, to grow, and to figure out how the skills that we have can be applied to create a world that can serve all people and the planet, then we're all in alignment. As an example, these things are all intersectional. So you asked earlier, is justice what we need? Well, justice can also be seen as a storytelling tool, right? When you start establishing what's right and what's wrong, and you help rewrite those narratives, and those who deviate from what is a social norm, what we can redefine as a new social norm, then we can start pointing more quickly towards the wrongs, and hopefully put more wind behind the sails to create more innovation and even better narratives. And so, I see all of this stuff as interconnected. And as long as we are able to sustain and maintain the energy to keep fighting, and to not get the heart too exhausted, or not get the mind too exhausted, and to reinforce and support each other as we move forward and try to do better and never be satisfied, then we're on the right path. So progress over any kind of destination, I think, is the name of the game.
To keep fighting.
Yeah, I mean, it's the idea of protopia, right? Protopia over that of utopia. We're not going to figure it out this generation. We're not going to figure it out next generation. We're probably never going to figure it out, because with every new set of solutions we come up with are going to come a new set of problems. I do agree that we're in a critical junction, and very soon we may pass a point of no return, and so clearly the stakes are higher. But every generation has had their share of challenges, and they've somehow all made it through, and here we are today. So there is cause for hope, right?
There is cause for hope. I love these silences because I can almost hear all of you thinking on the other side of the call. I'd like to leave a little space here, just not to guide the conversation, but to really feel what is emergent, to feel that we are tapping in with one another around this theme of activism and culp and re-evolution. Is there anything emergent, anything somebody would like to bring to the floor, to the space, something that you feel that can be spun into a pearl, some irritant that can get us moving in a new direction?
I'd love to throw one in there, Jurgis, and I think you know what it is already, and it's time. You know, I think time is hiding in plain sight as a tool for us to use, because most people have not actually questioned their relationship to time. They just kind of take it as a, you know, something that we all live with in the present moment. But the Greeks had different names for different types of time, in the same way as they had different names for different types of love. And they talked about chronos being clock time, linear time, and kairos being like all time, you know, the present moment, everything that will happen in the future and everything that has happened in the past. And there's something we can do when we step outside of our present experience of chronos, of clock time, and step into a time outside of time, where we can actually look at the design implications of the future of society based on timeless principles. I think it's a great privilege to be able to do that, but I also think it's a very effective tool. Because if we can design structures that are true today as much as they are true tomorrow, as much as they are true for all time past, and we can look to indigenous communities as great guidelines on this, with approaches like the 7th generation principle. And so this is something we've done. We just did a game in Damanhur on this, and they are like deeply experienced in stepping outside of the present time zone, and they actually created temples to the future of humankind, which I think is a fascinating concept. And so it's something we do every time we do an up game, is we step outside of the present moment and we go and say,
Lucian,
yeah.
Lucian, let me interrupt you for a second, because we've actually got 15 more minutes on air. We can always go a little bit over if you want, but
Sure.
There's something you're touching upon which is really cool, and I'd like to take these last 15 minutes to actually try this cosmic navigation. Actually, in the room with us is also Mark Smith, who's a friend who introduced me to the concept of backcasting, which is kind of dreaming audaciously, and what you call the up game, which is to really cast our minds into the future and try to weave back and make sense of everything that's happening now through the eyes or through a portal where everything worked out. We've had people say that this was very similar to Doctor Strange in one of the Marvel movies, saying that there's all these hundreds of thousands or millions or infinite scenarios where it failed except one, and that it is key for us to really visualize that scenario. So perhaps we can actually get the people in the room with us to engage in a little bit of playful backcasting from 2030. Is anybody up for it? If we keep it brief, if we keep the backcasting down to 2-3 minutes for each and every one of us, we might actually have a beautiful, interesting conversation from the future. And I don't know who wants to go first.
Well, since you brought it up, I'm going to jump right in there, Jurgis, of course. We're here beamcasting, beaming, that backcasting evolutionary alliance mediums. We're here to share what it is that we did along the way to get to a future we know our hearts is possible, that more beautiful future that we all know we carry that's the ideal that's been carried forth, that we're wandering the path that we're on, this perpetual emotion machinations that we engage in to carry forth this little flame, this chispa of life that we know is central to our foundation. And that's the story we tell here. What did you do along the way to arrive at that future that you know is possible?
All right,
That's
give
the
me a
question.
second. Give me a second. Let me guide it. Let me start it off. Let me pass the ball on to Tia. Let's see if this works. Let me say, Tia, do you remember when we were at COP26? And there was this whole discussion of good cop, bad cop. There was clearly a divide between the people who felt disenfranchised and the people who couldn't be arsed to budge. But remember what happened afterwards? Do you remember how nobody expected it? Nobody thought it was possible. But at the end of that conference, something magical happened that kind of put everything into perspective. Do you remember that?
Oh God, and how I do remember that. Do you remember that time when I was, just navigating these conversations about these frontiers that we're about to reach, like membranes, and these sort of porous edges that we were trying to figure out and mentally understand. But actually, it was much more about, as Sylvia Earle had described in one of her talks, that when I was 19, we didn't have what you had. And of course, back then we had no idea about the capability that we could potentially even have. So yes, I do remember that. And I do remember what we were able to achieve too. An earth replenished.
It's absolutely beautiful. I mean, back then we didn't even think that telepathy would be possible. It was a couple of years till we actually caught on that it was just consciousness trying to come awake, and we were just struggling like a teenager goes through growing pains. Amanda, do you recall that? Amanda, does she recall? Or maybe she's still thinking. Laura, do you remember that? Do you remember?
I do remember. I do remember when we realized that we needed to cut down on our CO2 emissions and sequester 10 gigatons of CO2 per year. And we've already made it down like most of the way with this amazing emerging technology. And, I'm so relieved that governments changed their subsidies. $6 trillion of subsidies to the fossil fuel companies, and they've rerouted those to these emerging technologies that are kind of supporting earth-based solutions and accelerating nature's genius. And I'm so grateful that we've been able to come that far in these, 9 years.
It's astounding. And also in the field of business, and how these new emergent kind of structures. Remember Lucien back in 2021 we were talking, and he was mentioning the whole problem between nonprofits and profit organizations. It's amazing how that resolved itself, and now we think of profits and nonprofits, and it feels like we're talking about the Stone Age, and helping people by bleeding them.
Well, now we've transitioned, we've made the big shift. The commons now outsizes the private sector. So any time that the planetary cooperative decides that the interests of private companies are not aligned with the collectives, we just outperform by out cooperating the competitive business models. So we now have the checks and balances necessary to hold to account corporate interests and the interest of the few over the many. And so it was a big part of transitioning money. What we didn't realize while it was going on was the kind of daylight robbery that was the quantitative easing, people used to call it. That was the fact that the governments around the world were addicted So the economic equivalent of the opioid crisis was the printing of money. And they were addicted to printing more money because it looked like economic growth, but it was actually just a tax on the poor. Because the wealthy were able to set aside their assets and protect their assets, but the cost of living was just increasing exponentially. And so it got to a point with the big shift where enough was enough, and we started to transition money itself. And we did a keto move on money, and it was actually fascinating because it was a system was created where for every dollar that was printed, the equivalent dollar of value would go into the commons, which actually kind of handicaps the extractive, like oil-based fiat currencies, and we transitioned into a world where it was actually designed from the very beginning to be in harmony with all life, not just human life, but all life, including future generations.
That's beautiful. And I think I remember that 2023 was the year that Benjamin won the Nobel Prize for his work on really like helping people get weaned off plastic and really, right? Was it 23 or 24, Benjamin? Remember?
It makes me so uncomfortable to claim any kind of credit like that. But thank you.
The mushrooms really played the protagonist role in this decade. They were recognized as really a supra kingdom above animals or plants, connecting us all, and their ability to remediate all of the toxins that late stage capitalism had infused into most cells around the earth. Mushrooms took them back, reclaimed them, and turned them back into biology and bioavailable nutrients so that we could breathe again, so that the rains didn't have plastic in them anymore. The mushrooms won many, many prizes.
For me, the beautiful thing about this activity is that it allows us to dream audaciously. And for me, for some reason, COP feels a little bit like a nightmare. There's so much dissonance. There's so much kind of like, I don't know, something feels stale, something feels off. And I'm not disagreeing with Dia in the sense that, yes, there are institutional shifts that are occurring, which are positive. But I find dreaming audaciously much more inspirational than getting caught up in the how. And if we're talking about, again, activism and re-evolution, I'd like to just kind of ask in the last 5 minutes what it is that can help us dream a little bit more audaciously, and how we can bring audacious dreaming and visioning to these kinds of spaces.
I love the Ready Player One movie, and the best quote in the movie for me was, "Reality is limited by your imagination." With audaciousness, just as much as George Land created a study of geniuses and how imagination was a superpower. In order for JFK to reach the deadline within 10 years to arrive at the moon, they introduced imagination as the opportunity of hiring an incredible team of people that believed that it could happen. I think that's where we are right now. To imagine.
Imagination as a superpower. We should hand it out as drugs to everybody, I think, here. That's beautiful. I love that. Who else has got a bite-sized piece of information before we're off the air? Or vision? Nobody? Come on, let it rip.
I think bringing it back to the indigenous people really seen as the leaders of this movement and brought into the economy. And it's hard for me to even imagine what that looks like, because I want to just defer to them. But recognizing that they steward 80% of biodiversity currently on the planet on 5% of the land. And yeah, imagining what that could be if we gave them more power.
I think that's such a lovely thought. I'm still kind of, I'm still under the hypnosis, under the spell of this idea that there are people whispering to water in the Amazon, whispering consciousness. And yesterday, when I was at the Indigenous event here in Glasgow, I kind of felt that I wanted somebody to whisper to water and to take like water guns and spray people with this structured water with positive beaming light. And it's funny because if you believe in the medicine of consciousness, of really elevating somebody's consciousness like I am, maybe just by playing a couple of chords or saying something nice to somebody else, you bring the heart dimension in. That's what these people have been working on. And I at least am a bit happy to see that each time their voices are more and more heard, each time their ideas are more and more represented, and each time we recognize them more as elders and an integral part of rebuilding our civilization. Ladies and gentlemen, this was RE&CO Radio. With you, we had Amanda Joy Ravenhill, we had Benjamin Van Wong, we had Lucien Tarnowski, Tia Cansada, Leah Wasserson as well. We bid you a very beautiful morning, afternoon, and we wish you dream a little bit more audaciously and envision with compassion so that other people can enjoy those visions of yours and be infected by them.